Mhm.
Not a lot of people are allowed in here.
And why is that?
Because it's the sanctum sanctorum,
The Holy of Holies.
sacred place of all. Saying this meeting is being recorded, do you want me to press continue?
That's right.
Yes, please.
Yes, please.
Right.
Yeah, hi. I drove back yesterday evening.
Sir Tom, we have over 50 signed up, and I think we're going to have more than that. So I'll wait until 10 o'clock, and then I'll make some announcements, and then we'll get rolling here. But we're so happy to see your face this morning.
Sorry, how many minutes have we still got?
About 2 or 3.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just in the process of recovering from being at dinner with the Princess Royal 3 days ago.
Wow.
Oh.
We want to hear about it.
I asked her, how are the family? And she said, we're all okay, except I'm a bit worried about my brother. And I immediately thought she was referring to the brother who is in some difficulty, namely Princess Andrew. But she was actually referring to the king. Although she didn't at that point. By the way, this is top secret. I've signed the Official Secrets Act, and you'll have to do the same. No, it was the 200th anniversary of the Royal Celtic Society, an organisation that developed in the 1820s to try and safeguard Highland tradition, which is quite ludicrous because Highland traditions were being destroyed by commercialisation at exactly that same time. So she's the patron, and we had the dinner in Holyrood Palace. And that's the reason I got to meet her and for her to reveal these secrets.
Well, and Sir Tom, when we get started, I hope you'll tell everybody about your involvement in the Queen's the proceedings and so forth.
Yeah, okay. When I've finished the lecture, there'll obviously be times for question and comment. But when I finish, I'll just tell you some of the things I've been doing about the concerning the funeral of the late monarch, which might be of some interest to you. Okay.
That'll be tremendous. We'll all wait for that.
I've done over 60 media responses to newspapers, radio, and television worldwide. For 3 days, Scotland was the centre, not only the centre of the world, but of the interplanetary system. And I regard that as the Queen's final gift to the land she loved.
There you go.
Yeah.
Bravo. Sir Tom, before we get started, I want you to notice that Bob Creighton is on with us today. Bob?
Is that a former student of mine?
You bet. many moons ago.
It's nice to meet you over the ether, Bob. And also to see you looking so well.
Well, thank you. It's interesting.
Unlike myself.
You're looking fine. I saw you in New York a few years ago. You're looking well.
No, there's been disintegration since then.
How are you doing? How's your eye? You were telling me you had a problem.
No, everything's okay now.
Oh, good. Pleased to hear it.
Well, that's not okay. That'll be permanent. I've only got 16% of sight in that eye, but this eye now is completely back to normal, as if I was 18 years of age.
Good for you. Good for you. And I see Gus, the president of Chicago Scots, just joined us. You should say hello, Gus.
Well, and I'm going to introduce Gus.
All right, there you go.
I'll tell you what, it's 10:01, and I'd like to go ahead and get the forum started. And for those of you who might not know me, I'm Connie Nestor, and I want to wish you all a heartfelt welcome to the Scottish American History Forum, which I believe you probably all know, is part of the Arts and Cultural Division of Chicago Scots, formerly the Illinois St. Andrew Society, which founded the oldest 501c3 charity in the state of Illinois way back in 1845. And of course, it was later named Caledonia Senior Living and Memory Care, and it's located in North Riverside, Illinois. Chicago Scots is dedicated to nurturing Scottish identity through service, fellowship, and celebration of Scottish culture, in addition to support of our Caledonia Senior Living and Memory Care campus. And so for additional information and our events, please access our website, which is at www.chicagoscots.org. And please give generously to our Caledonia Senior Care charity. And so now I would like to go ahead and recognize Gus, who is the president of Caledonia and Chicago Scots. And he's with us today to greet everyone and to answer Bob's prayers. So Gus, please take it away.
Thank you, Connie. Excuse me. Thank you, Connie. It's wonderful to see everybody, including, of course, Bob and Sir Tom. But great to see you as well, Connie. I want to say a couple of things to you. We had our golf outing this week, and Connie, as well as playing superbly and looking superb, gave incredible support to the fundraiser. And it was a matching gift that you gave, and it really motivated everyone. So I want to thank you for your generosity. And also congratulate you, Connie, having just been, your choice of academic institution is also superb. You've just been registered at the University of Stirling, which of course produced very handsome graduates. A report from Caledonia Senior Living. We've just opened the newly refurbished sheltered care wings and our intermediate care wing, and are welcoming the first residents in there at the moment. They look superb, and I'm looking forward to reporting that those are filled up in the weeks ahead. I'm also looking forward to introducing Sir Tom in almost precisely 3 weeks from this very moment, when he will give the keynote address at the Scottish North American Community Conference, to which you're all invited. Chicago Scots is one of the founding members, or founding partners, along with the American Scottish Foundation, of this conference. My predecessor, Wayne Rethford, started it over 20 years ago, and about 10 years ago, we took it on the road, and it's been hosted in New York, Detroit, up in Canada, and in Scotland. And I was delighted when Sir Tom agreed to give the keynote address. The theme of the conference is Expressions of Scottish Identity, and Sir Tom's keynote will be Icons of Highlandism. I'm really looking forward to hearing that. Other speakers include the Lord Lyon and Stephen Preston from St. Giles Cathedral. And Sir Tom, you mentioned that Scotland was the centre of the universe for a while there. Well, the one person who was the centre of that universe has a very strong link to Chicago. The pastor at the minister at St. Giles Cathedral was formerly, for 17 years, the head of Fourth Presbyterian Church and a member of our board. So for a while there, we felt connected in a really personal way to what was going on. So that's what's, and of course, Bob Crichton is also going to be speaking about his work on the new group that's coming together in New Hampshire. So we'll have the oldest and the newest Scottish societies talking on the same panel, the Scottish Charitable Society of Boston being the oldest and Bob's group being the newest. So I think that's probably enough for me, other than to say how grateful I am for Sir Tom taking the time to deliver the puzzle from the past. It has literally been the podcast as the centerpiece or the keynote at the Enlightenment series that Edinburgh University did. I've listened to that podcast of yours, Sir Tom, many times. Well, I've been stuck in traffic and it has saved my sanity, believe it or not. What's left of it at any rate. So greetings and thanks for joining us, and welcome, Sir Tom.
Thank you, Gus.
And I would like to just remind everyone that Sir Tom is the celebrated Fraser Professor of Scottish History and Paleography at the University of Edinburgh. He's joining us live from Scotland today. And Tom, we won't waste another second. We'd like to turn the meeting over to you now, please.
Thank you very much, Connie. And also thank you to Gus for those remarks. It's once again a pleasure to join you all and give you some thoughts on this important aspect of Scotland's modern history. I presume you can all hear me.
Yes.
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 Okay. I'm going to talk, as the title suggests, I'm going to talk about the extraordinary extent and impact and origins of the mass migration of Scottish people, with particular reference to the late 18th, 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm going to divide, to give some kind of cohesion and clarity to my remarks, I'm going to talk into three parts. The first is I'm going to develop for you, I'm going to mark out the nature of that emigration process, not only abroad, but also briefly to England. Then I'm going to tell you why I consider this to be a puzzle. As you know, there have been many writings on the nature and origins of Scottish emigration, principally because of the mark that Scottish people made on so many societies across the world, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries. But I've always thought the root of the problem, the root of the issue, at least in terms of why people left Scotland in such large numbers, is a puzzle. And the answers I've been giving over the last few years in various fora, and Gus referred to one of those, but also in my books, has meant that my attempt to resolve this puzzle is now called in the academic world the Devine paradox. It's not divine with an I, it's divine with an E. In other words, the people have started to accept that my resolution of the puzzle does stand up to the historical reality and the evidence. You can judge that for yourselves. I mean, I've even seen examination papers in other Scottish universities and indeed at Oxford saying, comment and interpret the Devine paradox. So God help those students who've never heard of it. And then the third thing I want to do, having given an indication of what I mean by this historical puzzle, I then want to go on and give you my thoughts on how it might be answered, how the paradox might be resolved. A couple of things I'll be saying at the beginning of that section is to, if you like, to consider what I suggest are false trails of explanation or investigation. And then after that, I'll go on to what I think are the fundamental factors explaining the apparent puzzle. So I'm a great believer in comparative history. In fact, most of my writings over the last 20 years have had at least some comparative tinge to them. I especially think that for small nations and regions, comparative history is essential, because the problem with small country history can be navel-gazing, introspection, and unawareness of what makes that country or that part of the world distinctive. The only way to demonstrate its distinctiveness, which then allows for analysis and explanation of the distinctiveness, is to see the country or region or place or area in comparative context. So there'll be a bit of that at the beginning of this lecture. We now know more or less the comparative emigration rates of 16 Western European, Central European and Eastern European countries. And the data we have are especially rich for the 19th and 20th centuries. Now, when you look at that number of countries, and you create then a kind of league table of out-migration, not in absolute terms, but in relation to the base population. In other words, in relation to the numbers of persons who left per head of population. Over 44 million, by the way, Europeans left for the rest of the world in the 19th century. For Scotland, it was 2 million. Obviously, compared to the overall figure, it seems quite small. But remember—
I just want to copy.
Sorry? Did someone speak?
Sorry, Sir Tom, that was somebody who just entered. Please continue.
Okay. The 44 million for the whole of Europe. Scotland's 2 million might seem relatively small, but remember the population of Scotland at the end, more or less at the end of my period, the census date of 1901, was just slightly over 4 million. And this gives the first clue of the extent of Scottish immigration compared to other countries in Europe. If you look at the league table, the three leaders in terms of hemorrhage or loss are Ireland, or were Ireland, Norway, and Scotland, in that order. Most of the time between 1841 and the 1920s, Ireland was the leader, not least because of the extraordinary horror of the mass emigration associated with the Great Famine. Then there were secondly, there were a couple of Scandinavian countries, rural-based societies, if you will, particularly Norway, and then Scotland in the third place. On 3 occasions in the later 19th and early 20th century, that is the 1850s, the 1880s, and 1906 to 1911, Scotland was second only to Ireland. And then in the interwar period in the 1920s, Scotland's loss figure was not only the worst in Europe, if you want to call it worst, in the 1920s. And not only that, it was the first time since the private census of Alexander Webster in the 1750s, the first time also from the official state census, the first official state census in Britain of 1801, that Scotland actually lost population. The population actually fell as a consequence of the sheer extraordinary scale of the emigration of the 1920s and early 1930s. So that's basically the problem, in a sense. That's the fundamental issue. Why so many departures in relation to other societies? And intriguingly also, especially in relation to some of the very poorest areas of Europe, mainly, of course, agricultural and economic structure. I'm thinking of parts of Scandinavia, but also parts of Italy, Poland, and Western Russia. All of these societies had emigration, but nothing like on the same level per head of population as Scotland. So why is this peculiar and a puzzle? The reason is that when we get into the 1850s, 1860s, all the comparative information we have suggests that Scotland was second only to England as the richest nation on this planet. I'm fond of quoting Sir Walter Scott's famous 2 or 3 phrases of introduction to his first best-selling novel, published in 1816, which looked back to the time of the Jacobite Wars in the 1740s. Waverley, of course, is the name of the novel. And in that introduction, he says, in no European nation has there been so fundamental and as all-pervasive a change as in this kingdom of Scotland. The rise of commerce and industry has produced a class of beings, he's talking about the Scottish population this time, a class of beings who are as different from their grandfathers in ways of life as the present English are from the days of good Queen Bess in the 16th century. So essentially what Scott is saying is, compared to England, the Industrial Revolution and the agrarian changes in Scotland were precipitous. They happened at a speed much faster in England, whose process to modernity was by contrast evolutionary rather than revolutionary. So what we have is a society, and we can really almost trace it down, that the real break with the past occurs around about the 1760s. There's some indications of development before that, but there's no evidence of what I would term structural change. I've always defined that to undergraduates as not change within a given social, economic, and demographic structure, but change of that structure, all enveloping change, so that by the end of the process, the world that's been created, particularly in the country I'm talking about at the moment, the country of Scotland, that world is different from the world that existed before the 1750s and 1760s in virtually every regard. And of course, the three manifestations of it, rapid urbanization by the 1860s, over 64% of the Scottish people live in towns, whereas in the 1740s, in the early stages of the 18th century, it was only about 1 in 10 of the population of the society. It was an overwhelmingly rural society at that point. And then secondly, we have the particular nature of Scottish industrialization, again, very fast. For the first phase, overwhelmingly in textiles. Then from the 1830s, 1840s, the great heavy industries of Scotland develop. The motor, if you like, the motor pulling the train of the rest of industrialism behind it, of course, was shipbuilding on the Clyde. But that series of industries also included various areas of heavy engineering, coal mining, iron, and steel making. And then the third, and the one I've been writing about most recently in some of my own work and books, the reshaping of the landscape of Scotland and the social structure of the old agrarian and rural world of Scotland by agrarian capitalism, by agricultural capitalism, which had huge social effects, especially in relation to population mobility and the disappearance of whole strata of Scottish rural society, the most significant, of course, being the cotter class, who were probably around a quarter to a third of the population of most rural parishes in Scotland in 1700. By about 1820, they had vanished, and literally vanished. No trace of them left. So why is it that a society like this, in the cusp of modernity, with the huge release of employment opportunities, with the huge increase in wealth, and even indeed to some degree working class incomes by the end of the 19th century, has such a large number of people who wish to leave the society for another way of life? And of course, that can be very challenging to do that, even to this day, with modern means of communication, both by air, road, and car and railroad. That was the, if you like to call it, that was the perplexing problem that I started to think about a number of years ago. And when I did, it became apparent to me that none of the orthodox explanations of Scottish migration in that period really fitted. And therefore I had to go further into the texture of the history of the country in order to come up with something closer to what I thought was intellectually satisfying and convincing. So then we go on to the, if you like, what is the heart of this presentation? That is the possible reasons why this occurred, how this puzzle or this paradox can be resolved. Now, if you looked at the literature when I started thinking about this would probably be about the late 1980s, 1990s. One of the key features in the discussion was that the Highlands had a special place in the out-migration. Not only it was argued because of the scale of movement out of the Highlands, but because of the notorious clearances, and also because it was the poorest area of Scotland. Therefore, it seemed to fit the notion that it was those who were under economic and social pressure who left. And that's no reason, and then it was, as I think, probably inevitable that Highland society and its history took centre stage. And it is actually the case, if you look at the period, especially from the beginnings of agrarian commercialisation in the Highlands from about the 1750s, through to the Great Highland Famine of the late 1840s, 1850s, that in relation to its population base, the Highlands did play a more significant role, a disproportionate role in Scottish immigration. That's not to say in any way that all those who left in that period were Gaels, but probably something of the order of a quarter to a third who left were Gaels. And of course, that was the population in the Highlands was beginning to move down in that period. So that was a quite substantial part of that population. So up to a certain period, the Highland factor, if you want to call it that, works. But it doesn't work at all from the late 1850s onwards, because from the census of 1861 up to the last census that I examined in the course of this investigation, that is the census of 1931, the number of Highlanders, the number of Gaels who contributed to the mass migration was falling rapidly over time until it became relatively minuscule by the 20th century. The reasons for this are obvious, of course, because Highland depopulation meant that the Highlands no longer contained the same level of population as they had done before the middle decades of the 19th century. But of course, the Highland factor left with a particular resonance, because in the 1850s, the single largest source of emigration in Scotland was in fact Gaeldom, because of the devastating effects of the Great Highland Potato Famine in that period, not causing death increase in the same way as Ireland, but rather huge levels of emigration in the same way as Ireland. So the Highland factor doesn't really work for the entirety of the period that I'm considering. So let's move on. A thesis that I think has got more going for it, a thesis which I think has got more compelling intellectual attraction, is the fact that the Scots have always been, since early medieval times at least, a migratory people. They've always engaged in international mobility. And of course, up till the later 17th century, that international mobility was not facing the West or the Antipodes, it was facing Europe. Let me just say a few words about that connection. One scholar, Christopher Smout, has identified the fact a number of years ago that although the evidence that he's basing his findings on were elusive and fragmentary compared to modern data, but he suggested on the basis of fragmentary evidence that existed that the proportion of young men below the age of 24 who were leaving Scotland in the middle decades of the 17th century was more or less the same as the proportion of the larger number who lived in Scotland in the middle decades of the 19th century of round about the same age. And the big factor, of course, propelling the movement of these young men in the period from about the 12th century through to the 17th century was the fact that Scotland's greatest export of medieval and early modern times was men, and especially young men of violence, young men skilled in the arts of war, the mercenary forces that were used almost as elite shock troops in the way the Highland regiments were used even as late as World War I. Shock troops at the head of the thrust of the armies, everything from Gustavus Adolphus in Sweden right to the monarchies of France in that period, and including even a significant number of the German states of the time. But it wasn't simply the movement of soldiers that was a factor in that period. It was also, of course, the continued movement of scholars, of clergy, of sometimes people moving away as a consequence of harvest crisis and the like. And above all, merchants, but not merchants of, the kind of tobacco lord status as was to come later, but really what we would now call peddlers. The annals of European history in this period are covered with reference, especially in the towns and cities, to references to poor Scottish peddlers trafficking their wares, and particularly in the southern Baltic states and Scandinavia in the north. So there is no doubt at all in terms of the evidence, and particularly the evidence in a comparative sense, there's no doubt at all that even in the medieval and early modern period, the movement of Scots on a regular and a persistent basis outside their native land was much, much greater than the movement of English people. And of course, the reason for it, essentially, in the medieval and early modern period, because Scotland was a vulnerable society to harvest failure. There was a much poorer society than England in that time. And of course, that reminds me of the fact that not only was there a European access to the immigration, but there was also a southern access, the movement to England. Again, very difficult to trace in an exact statistical way because we don't have the statistical evidences for it. So we've simply got to draw on chance survivals of data to be able to demonstrate that fact. So perhaps one more reasonable explanation of this mass migration in the 19th century was that the long centuries of movement to Europe, culminating from the early 17th century to the end of the 17th century, in the movement of Western-facing peoples to Ulster, which was very significant by the time we get to the last quartile of the 17th century, and especially during the so-called seven ill years of the 1690s, which were 5 actually, but nevertheless devastating in terms of movement. So from the Southern Highlands and Ayrshire and Galloway and Western Lanarkshire, you had a great exodus, but culminating in an even bigger exodus in the 1690s to the historic province of Ulster, and especially to the counties of Armagh, Down, and those eastern-facing counties. So a society accustomed over generations and indeed centuries to seeing its young, particularly, moving away. That seems to me a society that has long developed a culture of mobility, a culture where there is no great hazards, there are no great huge constraints on outward movement to other countries, and especially, of course, in that period to the Western and Northern Europe. So it could be argued that this kind of inherited tradition of mobility might serve to fashion the mentality of the later generations of Scots in the 18th century and at least in the 19th century. Perhaps even one could argue and speculate even into the 20th century.
Excuse me, Sir Tom. We can't hear you as well as previously, and I think you moved a little bit away from the microphone.
Okay, how can you hear me now?
Perhaps you can just project your voice a little bit.
Yeah,
Thank
I've
you.
just been sitting in the same place, so I don't know how that's happened. But I will do
I
that.
think you might have rustled some papers against your laptop, Sir Tom, and it might have might be
Can you
covering
hear
the
me now?
microphone.
Can you hear me now perfectly? Can you hear me now?
We can hear you pretty well.
Not as well as before.
I'm now at the point of shouting. Can you hear me now?
Nope.
No.
We can hear you, but it just isn't as clear as before. But we'll listen in. I mean, we can hear you, so don't let me interrupt.
Well,
further.
please advise me if it's becoming very, very difficult, because we might
It's-
have to have another go at it at another time. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you, Sir Tom. Yeah, I think you may have got a piece of paper over the microphone on the computer or something.
There's no paper near me.
Okay.
So it's a very curious thing. So essentially, what I was getting at when this technical hitch, as it were, started to happen, was I was saying that this long tradition of outward mobility may have been an element in creating a kind of particular mentality. I mean, to some extent, this is you could say this is a slight speculation. But a particular mindset and a particular habit of movement that may well have been a factor in the explanation that I'm trying to seek. But even then, we're not getting close to the intellectually satisfying answers that I'm looking for. And the reason why I'm saying that is because the fundamental reason why people left Scotland in significant numbers in the medieval and early modern periods was, of course, because it was a highly vulnerable northern society, a certain climatic zone, which suffered recurrent harvest failure right down, including down to the 1740s, of which the most famous one was that of the 1690s, but there were others stretching back in time. The difference in the period I'm now considering of the 19th and early 20th century was that Scotland had become a major food exporter. And as I said in the first part of my presentation, not only that, but Scotland had reached the position not only of being the second nation of empire, but also by the 1850s, 1860s, second only to England in terms of its gross national product. So what I'm saying to you is the economic basis, at least, of what had caused migration and the habit of movement in the medieval and early modern periods was no longer tenable as an explanation for the 19th century. Can you now hear me any better?
Much better, thank you.
Perfect.
No problem. I'm now trying to imagine myself nostalgically back in the lecture theatres where I cut my teeth as a university teacher, not using any microphones, but speaking to the person at the very back of the room as if he or she was an intimate of mine, and I had to reach them by upward booming of the voice. So we're now moving closer to the kind of areas that I think are much more realistic in terms of this search for a comprehensive explanation. One of the things to consider is to actually look for the explanation in these monumental economic and social changes which were making Scotland richer. I've always been interested in turning an apparent reason, an apparent negative reason, into an apparent positive reason, and vice versa. Because earlier, as you know, I argued that a constraint on immigration ought to have been, at least compared to the poorer societies of Western, Central, and Northern Europe, Scotland's growing wealth. But I think you could argue that the means to growing that wealth were such that there was likely to be a force making for outward migration in a substantial scale. And the first thing I'm getting at in that respect is the huge expansion of internal migration, firstly, in Scotland. Let's leave aside the emigration, let's leave the emigration aside for a few moments. The huge increase, unprecedented increase in the levels of people moving off the land and journeying to places of employment. I mean, it's an extraordinary fact that according to the census data between 1861 and 1914, all parts of Scotland, from Highlands to the borders, up to the Northern Isles and down the East Coast, were losing people. The only area in the country that was gaining people was the west central lowlands of Scotland, of course centred on Glasgow, but not simply Glasgow, Renfrewshire, Dumbartonshire, Stirlingshire to some degree, and also to some degree Ayrshire. The only exception to that generalisation, there was a few spots in the borders where the booming textile towns, mill towns, if you will, of the central borders were also attracting people. But that was as nothing compared to the West. The most important point of all is that people were on the move on a massive scale in this small country between the late 18th century and right into the later part of the 19th century. I used to use a technique to demonstrate this to undergraduate students. First of all, I would put a table up showing the condition and the spread, the spatial nature of Scottish distribution of population before modernity, before modernization. And it was fairly evenly spread, particular clusters, of course, in the eastern coastlands and in the central lowlands. But it was nothing like what was going to happen, because when the US Army Air Force first released its new photographs of Europe by night from space in the later part of last century, there are three great and striking features if we move from Western Europe. If we move from Western Germany through to the UK. The first is the Ruhr, inevitably, because the night lights demonstrate the density of population. The Ruhr, arching into Belgium. Secondly, what used to be called the Black Country in England, in this sense, it's the light country because it's shown up light in the darkness. The very great concentration from London right up almost to the borders of Yorkshire. But the most extraordinary thing of all is when you hit Scotland, total blackness to the north of the Clyde. Because remember, this has been taken at a very high level, and so you don't see the tiny pricks of light of villages and towns there. Total blackness to the north, a sandwich of light in the Forth Clyde Valley, and then within that, below that, again, complete absence of light in the Scottish borders. So here's my thesis. The Scots were mobile abroad to some extent, one of my theses, the Scots were mobile abroad because to some extent they were increasingly mobile at home. And when the steamship arrived, as it did from the 1860s onwards, it meant the journey time from the Clyde cut from 6 weeks to a week. So significant was that those who would normally be migrating for jobs in the country were able to actually move across particularly, of course, across the Atlantic to begin with, and seek opportunities there seasonally. And one of the things which is very intriguing to me is, by the end of the 19th century, a third of those Scots who leave, and principally, of course, those who are leaving for North America rather than Australasia and South Africa, a third of those Scots who leave come back. It's the beginnings of the Totten Migration. It's almost as if the local labour markets in the country have been transformed into global markets, or at least transatlantic markets, as a consequence of the steamship revolution, the connection to railroad, the telegraphic revolution, giving information on opportunities across the Atlantic, and of course, the development in some parts of North America of canals. Second thing I would say is worthy of serious consideration is the fact that one of the downsides to the new industrial economy, which was so transformational in Scotland, is that it's heavily export orientated. It faces world markets, and it's all interrelated. And most of it, of course, is in a particular part of the country, except for the major manufacture of jute, which is in Dundee. Jute clothing and jute fabric and jute packaging, etc. This means that although an economy which has given great wealth to many people in particular, but not to the majority of people necessarily, it's also a society which is vulnerable. It's vulnerable to the oscillation of the global trade cycle. Okay, it's heavily orientated towards markets outside Scotland and indeed Europe. And at the same time, it's heavily interrelated and integrated. So if you like, if shipbuilding has a 2 or 3 bad years, then there's a domino effect in some of the others. When you look at the key years of emigration, when the normal fluctuating pattern becomes a semi-deluge, it's when they're depressed years or before the depressed years in the industrial labour market in Scotland. That's when you see the shock effect. That's when you see the exodus. The second thing I would say in relation to the industrial, the nature of the industrial society, for reasons we still don't quite understand, in the later 19th century, Scotland was a low-wage society comparatively. I've looked at 12 industrial sectors, most of them grouped in the mammoth industrial complex of West Central Scotland and Clydeside. And in virtually every case, the average wage levels, especially for men, are lower or were lower than the normal pattern in England. That explains why during this period, and especially between about the 1850s and 1914, 600,000 Scots also left for England. There was hardly any migration to the north on that scale. So again, one reason for what I'm talking about could have been the fact that when it becomes possible for literate Scots, and of course, as you know, we all know that in the 19th century, and especially later 19th century, they were overwhelmingly a literate society. Few were more literate than Europe. So they look at the material, they look at the press, and they find out about the wages in Chicago, in New York, in the agricultural zones of central and western USA and Canada, and they make the conclusion that to a greater extent than the English worker, they feel disadvantaged because of the lower average wage rates for industrial and even indeed agrarian employment compared to London. So if you like, the gap's wider in their mindset. That is, it seems to me, as a very important trajectory, as a very important influence, likely to generate at least an interest in immigration in this period. And then we're coming to the end, so that we'll have time for questions. This is, historians never, and I certainly being one of them, never like to give monocausal explanations for complex developments and transformations. But if you were to ask me what I think is in this period, at least for the Scottish people, is a primary force, it is the fact that these emigrations from Scotland were not emigrations of push, but were essentially emigrations of pull. The majority of Scots left to do better for themselves and their families. They migrated largely for opportunity reasons. And why I can say that is the people who left, in the large scale at least, were not the poorest in society, were not the slum dwellers who were suffering in miserable conditions and paltry earnings. It was the skilled and the semi-skilled, not only from industry, but you think, for example, of the training that went into the development of a highly skilled Scottish farm servant, especially a boy who, going up to manhood, became the master of the horse trade, the ploughman. These individuals were in great demand across the world because of their skills in agriculture. And that's one of the reasons why the Scottish gardener became almost as classic a figure as the Scottish engineer in this period, or the Scottish doctor, or even indeed, may I say, the Scottish professor. So the allure of the new world, and in the eyes of many, the better world abroad, was partly materialistic, therefore, but a better way of life, perhaps, more opportunities for the next generation, and the like. But it was also, I think, a reflection of the fact of the nature of these new societies in North America, in Australia, in South Africa, and in New Zealand. And even for a few, also in India, Asia, and even for an even smaller few in Latin America and much of Africa. And that is, all these societies had one thing in common. They were developing, clearly, and some of them eventually became a superstar nation in material terms. That is the nation whose people I'm talking to at the moment. But in the 19th century, they had vast acreages of land. They could easily recruit cheap labor from Central and Eastern Europe, and even from Southeast Asia and China. But what they lacked were people of skill and semi-skill, those who had the knack to help with the industrial and agrarian changes that these societies lusted after. Very many of these individuals who made up the majority of Scots leaving were migrating from one of the most advanced economic systems on earth. They were exactly what the New World wanted, and the New World was willing to pay for them handsomely. That's my analysis. Hello?
Thank you, Sir Tom.
Thank you.
Is anyone there?
We had all been muted and so forth so that we could focus on you, but we're certainly here. Well, wow. Well, I would like to open the floor to discussion and question answer with Sir Tom.
Connie, I think there's one from Bruce. If Bruce, are you still on the line? Otherwise, I can read.
I'm very definitely still on, but it looks like my video has been stopped. But
Jack, will you
really sort of
everybody back on, please?
really a question about the continental European conscription laws and how they impacted immigration from, the countries like France and Germany that had these laws. The fact that the 18 to 21-year-old prime age for, I guess, immigration would have an army duty, and the governments would give other restrictions, making immigration a little more difficult from those countries. But that Scotland and Ireland didn't have those restrictions.
Yes. Nor England.
Yeah.
Nor Wales. So that's why I take your point, that could be a temporary factor constraining immigration from certain European societies. On the other hand, it could be in the longer and medium term, a factor in immigration, because of course that often led to mobility, not least during wartime, when young soldiers were created, moving about as armies during the periods of European war. But the main way I would answer it is to compare Scotland with those societies which didn't have such recruitment laws, that is, those in the rest of the British Isles. Even by that comparison, the Scots emigrated disproportionately to the base number, the per capita, in a per capita basis. I'll try and be relatively quick with the questions so that I get as many in as possible. We'll just see how it goes.
John, I see your hands raised there.
Yes, thank you. Sir Tom, so you mentioned that there were, periods of particularly high immigration, and in the Chicago area, which is not well known, but after New York, Chicago was for many decades actually the highest number of Scottish immigrants came here in the U.S.
I did know that. Yes, that's fascinating.
Yeah. And of course the biggest wave was in the early 1920s from the Clyde side after all
Exactly.
In 1923 super peak, the highest level. But there was also.
So I've just got to pick up because if you look at that, which was by far the biggest decade that I looked at in terms of out-migration, it was overwhelmingly to the USA rather than to Canada and to other places. So it's not surprising that Chicago, New York, and other cities in the USA would experience such an influx of people with strange accents during that decade.
Well, I think what's less known is that there was also the other period where there was a major surge was in the 1880s, and a lot of the infrastructure of the Scottish, the Scottish Chicagoans come from that period. And you mentioned the 1880s was a particular period in which there was a lot of immigration.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if if you looked at that, if there's particular causal reasons that there was such a surge of immigration in that decade.
Yeah, well, what I know is from the work of an economist, especially long dead now, called Brinley Thomas. What I do know is that the 1882 to 1885, the big losses of people, especially male workers, the usual type, skilled or semi-skilled, but of course coal miners, they may not have been seen to be skilled, but they had what I would call the knack. That is the training that eventually allowed them to take down a seam in a very effective way without causing necessarily human casualties. But the very interesting thing is, despite the unemployment, which may have helped to trigger emigration in that decade, what tended to happen on both sides of the Atlantic was a kind of syncopation, so that after the first period of unemployment in the UK and crisis and economic depression, that was normally followed in the 19th century by an upturn in the transatlantic economies. So you had a kind of double whammy. On the one hand, there was a push factor operating, but on the other hand, there was also maybe a year or two delayed, a pull factor.
That certainly makes sense. And, until the 1890s, when everyone's economy kind of crashed, and, the emigration certainly flowed in both out of Scotland. So.
Yes.
And, you also mentioned that the factor of return immigration.
Yes.
What's really interesting in the Chicago area is that after 1930, the number of Scots who left Chicago, or the number of Scots who went back to the U.S. as a whole back to Scotland, was greater than the number that came here. And,
yes, exactly. Yes. I think, for example, if we were able to get the number of local studies going on this particular issue of Scottish movement to North America, rather than the big aggregative studies that I'm thinking of, if you get one of the local studies, it'd be fascinating to see the different frisons, the different variations at the local level, with some periods and some places is showing limited out-migration and others not so. But one of the things that's it's a commonality among it all is the remarkable way in which ordinary people had an antennae sense for what the labour markets were like on both sides of the Atlantic.
Well, and partially that is because they had relatives already living there. So it wasn't just the paper, they were getting letters from.
No, the relatives were the biggest source of information because, of course, they could be trusted. So once emigration reaches a certain level, as it did very quickly by the middle decades of the 19th century, you have a whole reservoir, you have a whole set of intelligence and agencies, you know, among families, providing the up-to-date information which can be trusted for their people at home, and even giving them a bed for the night and introduction to local employers when they arrive.
One point on that. So my grandparents came here in that 20s period, and my second cousin, who still lives in Dundee, said that in his family, the choice in 1923 was either Clyde Bank or Chicago, and they lived in Port Glasgow, and obviously the Brown shipyard in Clyde Bank was drawing a lot of people. And
well,
the port.
See, that supports the point I was making.
Yeah.
What you were getting was a kind of meshing, a fusion of the two labour markets. That family, the family you referred to, your family, are saying they're not comparing Dundee with Glasgow, they're comparing Dundee or the Clyde or whatever with an American city.
Yeah. And it helped, of course, that they had a great aunt who had come to Chicago in 1910, and she'd come back to visit after the war and talk about the city. And my grandmother said when she came here, she thought it was fairyland. It was just so amazing, compared to Port Glasgow.
But the other thing is you've got to take into account the range of other influences that I mentioned, because remember, most European societies by about 1900 had people living across the Atlantic. So the kind of things that we're talking about at the moment were affecting most countries.
Sure.
Why are the Scots, if you like, still distinctive?
Thank you.
No problem.
Gordon had a question.
Yes, my name is Gordon Telford.
Hi.
I'm a distant relative of Thomas Telford, who
A person whose
did
name
a lot of
I
the
know.
What's that?
A person whose name I know.
Now, and one of the things I wanted to ask you about, and I think I know what the answer was, but there was this big expectation when the Thomas Telfords and the other civil engineers and the Parliament and everything decided to build the new roads into Scotland and bridges and make it easier to get into the Highlands and to get out of the Highlands. That even the public works aspect of it, surprisingly, thousands of Scots were employed in this. Why didn't that have as big an impact on the population and slow down the immigration when the Highlands got opened up and when all of these Scots got employed on the immigration?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. There's two reasons for it. These experiments were short-term, first of all, and therefore they were ephemeral. But as far as the transportation systems are concerned, all the evidence I have about Highland movement within the Highlands and to the lowlands was simply by walking, and sometimes walking simply over moorland tracks. So again, the effect would have been pretty limited. The other aspect, of course, is that with the growth of closer and sturdier ties with the lowlands economically, then the Highland people, the Gaels, begin to find out more about what's available and what the opportunities are there. I mean, one of the things that struck me when I first looked at Highland migration, that there's a geographical correlation up to about the 1850s, 1860s, between proximity to the lowlands and Highland migration from Highland parishes. But then when we get to the middle decades of the 19th century, you see that starts to break down, and they're coming from all over. It's partly to do with the new education in English, It's partly to do that many families have been sending their young for seasonal migration to the south, not permanent, seasonal migration, and they come back and tell the stories, etc. And one of the things in terms of a push factor, which is completely underestimated in the literature as far as I know, we all know about people being thrown off the land, but remember the last major clearances in Highland Scotland were in the 1850s. After that, I would say a much more efficient system for getting rid of people was introduced, and which not even the Napier Commission laws of the 1880s could tackle or change. And that was many landowners determined to oppose subdivision of croft holdings among the next generation, even to the extent of threatening eviction for families who allowed a son to marry, because that created a danger that the new generation would settle on the thing. You see, the catastrophe of the famine hardened the attitudes, perhaps already hard, of Highland landed elites, because what scared them above all else was the imposition of an able-bodied poor law, whereby ratepayers would have to pay to support people who could not pay them, the very poor, who maybe starting to experience illness and the problems of old age, who couldn't support themselves. So the urge to get people off the land was just as intense in the 1860s and 1870s, but it was done by more subtle means, which have only now been recorded in more depth and detail by scholars.
What would be, of your writings and of your publications, the best publication to better understand your thoughts on all of this?
In terms of immigration, there's no doubt about what it is. I set out. I mean, this happened by chance, but in 1998, I published a book called The Scottish Nation. It was it was published in 1999. And ironically enough, it was late because I was vice principal at a Scottish university in the previous few years. So I was a kind of academic manager. I kept my teaching going, but I was essentially involved in that other sphere. So it was a year late, and coincidentally, it came out in the Parliament Open. So there was a very great pizzazz about it, especially since it was a major English publisher, Penguin Books, who were dealing with it. So then a few years later, my editor at Penguin, I've published 5 books with Penguin now, my editor at Penguin suggested, why don't we have the Scotland trilogy in lights? So the first piece, the second volume in that trilogy was called Scotland's Empire, 1603 to 1815. Now, if you're interested in the emigration of that earlier period, that's the focus of that book. The second one, of course, which is more relevant to the present talk, is more relevant to what I've just said over the last 45 minutes or so, is To the Ends of the Earth, Scotland's Global Diaspora, 1750 to 2010. It's almost all about the origins, the nature, the impact of Scottish immigration throughout the world, not simply across the Atlantic, throughout the world. And perhaps most importantly of all, how did the Scottish variable influence other societies? Because you see, if you've got an ethnicity which is in possession of some of the levers of imperial rule, as the Scots were, you know, the old aphorism, England ruled the empire, but Scots actually ran it, then of course they're going to develop systems which they knew at home. And so therefore you find this, and this is one of the reasons why, not simply because Scottish history is the history of my own country, but this is one of the very many reasons why I find Scottish history so fascinating. First of all, it's a huge laboratory for all sorts of important economic, it's important historical issues, but also it allows the historian of a single country to go global. I mean, when I wrote those books, I had to become or develop a certain degree of expertise, not in terms of original research, but I had to read a fairly vast set of bibliographies. Okay.
I had only,
I'm sorry, John.
I just wanted to add, having read all three of those books recently in the last 2 years, I would recommend them all. I mean, they're
Thank you very much.
fascinating.
Send me an email and I'll put it on the next edition. I'll head it, you know, from a very distinguished citizen of Chicago.
So Tom, I have a question that I'm dying to ask. I think
I'm just going to say, Connie, who prefers to remain anonymous. Okay. Right.
Sorry.
What's your question?
Yeah, so, you know, I'm wondering about the political ideologies, which you really haven't delved into to any extent. And I would think that the migration, to certainly some degree, would be based on people's desire to be free from a monarchy and to achieve self-determination. And I think...
I understand what you're going to say. On you go.
Sorry?
Is that what you want me to answer?
Yeah, because, you know, we're Americans over here, and a lot of our founding fathers, you know, a good percentage were from Scotland, and
No, I
we're
mean,
looking for independence.
Yeah. I mean, I addressed some very bright students yesterday in a lecture from Stanford University in the States who are visiting Edinburgh for a couple of weeks. And the topic was the impact of the Scottish Enlightenment on the making of the USA. And obviously, therefore, Scots did have a big role in that. Although, ironically enough, during the revolution itself and after it, Scotophobia developed for reasons I don't have time to go into at the moment, but big levels of Scotophobia, hatred of Scots, including as late as 1786, Georgia publishing a law saying that Scots were not allowed to enter the colony unless they swore on the Bible loyalty to the forces of what they called patriotism, that is the new republic. Now, the thing is this, Connie, how can I, as knighted by the late Queen, possibly say that monarchy is a bad thing? Which was one of the points I think you were implying. This would be regarded as lese majesty. And despite my former service in Military Intelligence 6, it's possible, therefore, if I say this on air, which I'm saying at the moment, I might be approached by the Honours Subcommittee of the Palace and told to hand my regalia of knighthood back. This is a joke.
Oh boy!
This is a joke, of course. But to get the more serious level of your point, I find the Scottish attitudes to going, for example, let's take the States, to going to America, is an enlightenment in terms of better opportunities for employment. And I'll give you a classic example of it, especially also including Canada. Remember, the vast majority of people who worked on the land in the 19th century in Scotland were landless. They had no stake in the land. Only a few tenant farmers had long leases, but they were a small proportion of the population. So it's quite clear that a burning motivation for people from the countryside to go across the Atlantic was what they called independency. And it wasn't independency of a political type that I can grasp, because remember, everybody by the end of 1900, apart from women, everybody had the franchise in the early part of the 20th century in the UK, including Scotland. So, I mean, there was not, apart from the monarchy, of course, there was very little in the way of significant differences between the two democracies. But as far as awareness of a better way of life and a freer way of life and a more liberal approach, which would allow what, as I say, what they called independency, to be your own man, if you will, individualism, if you want to prefer that as a term. For people working on the land, it was their only route to landed possession. There was no hope, given the concentrated nature of Scottish land ownership, still the same concentrated relationship to this day, less than 1% of the population owning land. There was no way to get that, but there was a way to get it in the prairies.
Yes, I might add that the after the Civil War, when the slaves, newly freed slaves, wanted their freedom,
Yes.
they identified economic freedom as
Yes.
probably more important than political freedom, because
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Well, if a person doesn't have a crust, if a person doesn't have a accommodation, a roof over the head, and enough to eat, well, it's that's much more important than perhaps even getting the vote. That will come later when people are in a stable economic situation, or a more stable economic situation. But anyway, I'm glad for that comment, that question, Connie. Have you had enough?
Clearly not. Sir Tom, there's a comment here from Susan saying, can we entice you back to discuss Scotophobia?
You know that as far as the Chicago Scots are concerned, I am already completely seduced by you. And so the next time you invite me, I'll come back to talk about Scotophobia.
Well, thank you.
And not only that, I argued to these students, and there were several members of staff there as well, and they were all in IT, because, as you know, Stanford has a world reputation in IT and computer science. I argued that this is one of the reasons why, at least among, not including people like yourself who have a real interest in these matters, why in one publication the author said, when Americans ever think of Scotland, he's talking about modern Scotland, what they think of is kilts, Bens and Glens, that television series whose name I forget. What is it called?
Outlander.
Outlander. Yes, the writer of Outlander, Diana Gabaldon, gave me an extremely good review of the Scottish Clearances book, and of all places, the Tory-orientated Sunday Telegraph, and the one-liner, which of course the publishers jumped on. It's so damn readable. But anyway, these are the things that they think of instinctively. So as the ordinary American, if they ever think of Scotland at all. And I argue that this was one of the main reasons why I wanted to give them this lecture, to demonstrate that Scotland's greatest ever gift, not only to the world, but especially to the USA, was the Scottish Enlightenment, because it was a formative factor philosophically, politically, and in terms of the generation of Scottish-based and influenced education, particularly at the College of New Jersey, that is now Princeton. Because at that college, if you take by the time John Witherspoon, the Scottish president, died, they had produced right from the president, that is former pupils, former students, James Madison, right down to members of the Supreme Court, justices of the Supreme Court, and nearly 100 of these individuals who were really the formative force in the planning of the administration and the original ethos of the USA, educated at what became Princeton, and educated especially in the humanities faculties, in the humanities areas of philosophy and history, and particularly in philosophy, moral philosophy, which was the great Scottish emphasis, how citizens should rule and have ruled their lives, and helped to fashion the two main documents of the American Revolution. The first, of course, being the Declaration of Independence, written by Jefferson, heavily influenced by Enlightenment Scots. And at the same time, the other one was the National what is it, the national, the statement of nationhood, or whatever you would call it. You will almost certainly know about all this, but I'm sure you will agree that the vast majority of Americans, American friends who don't have these connections back to the old country, at a dinner party, and you raise the fact that actually Scotland, in a political, Scotland in an intellectual sense, helped to mold the early days of the USA, they'll think you've had too much whiskey.
Hey, Don McLeod, did you have a question or a comment? You're muted though, Don.
Bottom left should be the mute button.
Can't hear you.
Here, let me.
There you are.
Can you hear me? Yes. Well,
Yes.
we survived the hurricane. It hit Florida. It hit Florida
Congratulations.
hard. We got almost 6 inches of rain here in southeastern North Carolina.
My God, it sounds like Hamilton.
So got quite a bit of wind, but no damage to trees.
Good.
So we came out well. But
Well
the
done. Well done. We're all pleased for that.
The Scotland County Highland Games were totally called off, which is
Honestly?
unfortunate. Actually, they could have been held today, I think, but they were called off due to the hurricane.
Will they take place again?
Not this year.
Not this year, no.
Yeah.
Oh, that's sad.
Canceled for the year.
Yes.
Anyway, I enjoyed your presentation immensely. Very good.
Thank you very much.
Bob has his hand raised.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much, Jack. Tom, that was absolutely marvelous.
Listen, Bob, did this bring back freestyle of nostalgia?
I'll tell you, there was an expression there I hadn't heard for many years. It could be argued. You and I go back to being much younger men, and I'll say this and not have you blushing, but you've always been a personal hero, because I think that I can't think of anyone else who has changed the perspective of Scotland so much over the last 50 years as you have, in a very robust, with a very robust intellectual approach and a very non-emotional approach to Scotland's history, its heritage, and what have you. And because I go back and forward, I see that impact that you've had in so many different ways. Over here, I remember when I came to the States at first, there was this very much, and it still exists in many areas, the old Brigadoon view of Scotland.
Yeah.
And I think even from your time of, looking at the tobacco trade and that early sort of work of just showing our history, you can't look at it through rose-tinted specs. There is a warts and all interpretation. I think that has helped immensely, particularly in Scotland, for Scots to get a better understanding of where we are. There's a lot of things we can be proud of. We can be very, very proud of a lot of things that you talked about today. There's other things that we have to look back and say, well,
and this is principally the reason, Bob, why when it became obvious to me that the evidence was rapidly accumulating about Scotland's involvement, very, very significant involvement, not in the slave trade, but in the results of the slave plantations, I wrote an essay which has been multiple reprinted called "Did Slavery Make Scotia Great?" In other words, did the markets and the capital and the profits released from disproportionate activity in trades that were slave-based, like cotton, like sugar?
We lost him.
Oh.
He just he got cut off. He may try and get back on, of course.
I think he may try to get back on. And Jack, if there's anything you can do there, but I want to focus on him if he comes back. I do want to remind everybody that next month on November 5th, we have Professor Edward MacDonald, from the University of Prince Edward Island, and he's going to speak to us on Scottish settlement of Prince Edward Island and its implications for island society and culture. So I hope you'll all make an effort to tune in for that discussion as well. It should be very interesting.
This was wonderful today, Connie. Thank you.
Oh, well, they're wonderful every month. So please, all of you, we'd love to have you every month.
I have a question as a novice to Scottish culture and history. Is it okay if it may not be relevant and I may sound ignorant or maybe ridiculous, but I was puzzled. So this summer I traveled to Cape Breton Island, and there was this ship called the Hector. And the travel guide there said it was a very tiny ship, and she said it was a real size, and it was really tiny. And she said that there were 200 people in one ship from Scotland to Cape Breton. So all 200 people were inside this tiny ship. And I think most of them survived, and that's how they settled in Cape Breton Island. But somebody asked, how come all 200 people were in one tiny ship? And somebody said, oh, because they were Scottish, and people left. I'm like, ha ha ha, they left. And I couldn't understand why that is funny. Could somebody explain that to me? I think it's something to do with the Scottish culture or something.
Who wants to
I think I can suggest an answer that, Scots have the reputation for being frugal. And if there's 200 people crowded on a ship, there's probably a smaller passage money per passenger if they crowd on a little ship like that.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I wish Sir Tom were here to answer that, but I'm aware of a couple other reasons. During these mass migrations, sometimes entire congregations would get on a single ship and come, the minister and the entire congregation, and they all wanted to be on and together and to make the voyage together. So that may have been a reason. I know during the clearances, people were rounded up and put on ships almost virtually against their will with none of their possessions, just the shirts on their backs. And they were crowded onto similar ships that were used for the slave trade, and I say that with great regret and sadness. But I think there were many reasons. I have a feeling the reason they laughed is because there are a lot of people in that area who are Scottish by ancestry, and it was probably just an inside joke that they'd been through so much, and everything happens to us. But Bruce, I could be wrong.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Connie, if I may.
Please.
Yes, I just did a talk on the Scottish migration into the Cape Fear area of North Carolina.
Oh.
And in my research, I came across port records from Brunswick Town at the mouth of the Cape Fear River. Let me see, December the 1st, 1774, a ship named the Cato arrived from the Isle of Skye with 314 Highland passengers. So these little ships did have quite a few immigrants, and it said up to 20,000 came in through the Cape Fear River and settled, of course, the sandhills of North Carolina.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob.
And we had just on the Mayflower alone over 100 passengers. And if you've ever been on that replica of the Mayflower they have in Plymouth, you can't believe that 100 people plus crew actually lived on that thing for several months. Just about all the immigrant ships were very crowded in those days, not just the Scots ones.
That's a good point, Bruce. Bruce, sometime we need you to come and talk to us about the Scots and the Civil War. I need to get with you.
I think I've done that already.
My understanding from reading about the migration is a lot of the ships that brought the Scots to Canada and the United States were actually bulk ships. They would be shipping lumber from North America to Europe. And then because they were empty coming back, they would fill up with immigrants. So these were not glorious ships to transfer the people, especially from the Highlands.
Bill, that's a good point. The Cato that I was recently talking about, the manifest, it said it came under ballast. So in other words, the human cargo was pretty light, so it was full of ballast stones. Then they would have been unloaded, and the return would have been naval stores. Back then, it was very important commodities for the British Navy. That would have been pitch, turpentine, and tar, which is distilled from the longleaf pine trees. So you're right, there's a two-way street.
And there was one other issue. The fact that the Scots would pay ahead of time to be on the ship. So the owners of the ship already had their money. They didn't have to worry about not, getting their money at the end, like the cargo would have to be purchased at the other end of the trail.
That's a good point.
Thank you for all the good answers. Now I understand better.
I'm just trying to see if I can find Sir Tom, but please continue the discussion.
The Clan Cloud actually wrote a book about the migration of our clan. And it was interesting that, like we talked about, the fact that all the land was already purchased, already owned by the landowners. There was no opportunity to own land. And that was one of the biggest drivers for Scots or the Highlanders to leave and go to North America.
Well, the whole notion of freedom in those days, as I was mentioning, as Sir Tom mentioned, was that you're not truly free unless you own your own farm or business. The idea that if you're working for somebody else, there's always a possibility you might get fired or, who knows what. And so the idea of political independence dovetail with the idea of economic independence too, not just freedom to work anywhere you want, but being responsible for your own economic well-being.
The other point of the book was that within one generation, they had very much succeeded economically here in North America.
I just wanted to remind people too that the magnitude of the independence in that my great-great-grandfather, he put down 4 stakes and you had 200 acres that was almost free, and your only obligation was to develop it. If you weren't farming or you hadn't built a home on that land in I think it was 3 to 5 years, you lost it. So that it fit the Scots mentality at that point in time about what they wanted to do with their lives. But this wasn't just a little plot. This was significant amounts of land that they got.
Yeah, especially by European standards. The 160 acres that they promised for a homestead was, 40 acres was probably more the usual farmstead in England and Scotland at the time. So this is 4 times as much.
Yes.
A little bit more. Usually the homestead lands were a little bit more remote economically. So it's a little more difficult to ship your produce to market. But the land holding itself was amazing.
It was a big motivation. Oh, by the way, my family ended up in Prince Edward Island on a farm in Prince Edward Island in the 1840s. So it'll be interesting next month.
One
thing
I was going to ask Sir Tom about, he mentioned the gross national product in Scotland, but if it, if conditions there are like they are here, that gross national product is not evenly distributed among the population. And with the vast majority going to maybe even the top 1%. So it's not all what it appears to be.
Yeah, I was curious about that comment too, and I wonder if he was doing that as sort of a proxy for per capita income or average income rather than gross national product, because gross national product is the total number, but per capita income is the per person number. And maybe want a little more explanation on that point.
I think one thing we got to remember, though, is that not all the immigrants who came here with these great hopes and the aspirations to settle land succeeded. And one of the reasons 1/3 of them went back was they were sorely disappointed with what they found here. They go out to the wilds of Western Canada and find that there's nothing there in terms of community and nothing in terms of social infrastructure. There's just a lot of land that they have to work on, and it's hard to export their products. Similarly, a lot came to the urban areas like Chicago, and they thought the wages were great, but then they found that the housing was inadequate, and that there was also a lot of people went back. So.
I've done some studies on the advertisements that they tried to do to lure immigrants to Western Canada, among other things. And according to the pictures they had that they were circulating, all you had to do was just sort of wander in and throw a few seeds on the ground, and you'd have a thriving farm, a beautiful, clean house. The pigs wouldn't poop, basically. I mean, it was just immaculate, and everybody was perfectly dressed and everything. Obviously, they had promotion, just like they do today with new housing starts. But I wonder how much the Scots believe these wonderful advertisements of these lands out west.
Actually, before we went out for a trip to Prince Edward Island and then all the Canadian Maritimes, the travel agent asked us to read Island by Mr. MacLeod. I forgot the first name, but in that book, the description of the Scottish immigrants were very, how do I say, depressing. So they were all in the fishery, lumber, and the mining, and the life of those people were described a little bit dark and miserable. So it's a little bit, I think, different. And before I left the travel and before I read the book, I had this fancy image, like imagery of Scotland and Scottish immigrants with the castles and all these beautiful things. But the book kind of broke my image. So I don't know.
The author was MacLeod.
I'm sorry?
For the island, the
Yeah.
author of that was a MacLeod.
Oh, MacLeod, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, that was Alistair MacLeod who
Yeah, Alistair
wrote that.
MacLeod.
We talked about things weren't always great for the immigrants. One of the charters of the St. Andrew Society was to make sure no Scottish immigrant would be buried without in a potter's grave. And we actually have big section of cemetery where we buried many impoverished Scots, which didn't have a chance to be buried properly.
Yeah, so what I got from the book was like Scottish immigrants, like many other immigrants, their life was very similar to those people who went through all these difficulties.
And the Highlanders had one other problem. They spoke Gaelic, so they had a language issue.
Yes, just like other immigrants.
Yes.
Any more
Leon said-
discussion?
Oh, sorry, Connie.
No, please.
I was
Please.
just going to read out Leon's comment. He said, the Homestead Act of 1862 gave 160 acres of land. The act became the major recruiting incentive in Europe for the U.S. Army.
Thank you.
I also wonder if how Sir Tom's point about independency was interesting because I mean, he's right. By the end of the 19th century, in terms of political freedoms, the UK and America were very similar on point, but also the West had been, to a large part, settled by then, and industrialization really was getting going in the United States. So I wonder if those Scots who left the United States to go back to Scotland, who were somewhat disappointed by the US, were hoping for something a little more agrarian and not industrialized like the country that they had sort of left, because I'm sure that they could have, you know, immigrated to a major city within the UK and gotten a good industrial job or an industrial job. And when they came to the United States looking for something different, they also found, you know, large cities with large factories and primarily unregulated, you know, industries with bosses and not the independency that they were looking for.
Actually, the studies show that most of the Scottish immigrants who came to the U.S. certainly after, you know, the 1860 were urban people with urban skills, and most of those who are seeking land and agrarian opportunities either went to Canada or Australia and New Zealand as well. I mean, in much higher proportion of the kind of Scots who came from agrarian areas ended up going to elsewhere in the empire, and it was the city folks who came to the U.S. because they knew that there were jobs, and actually, as Tom pointed out, you could read in the Glasgow newspapers in the 1880s what the wage rates were in various cities here, and you know, and as the U.S. became an industrial superpower, it attracted even more. One of the big draws in the 1920s was Detroit because of the car industry, and it was easy to, you know, emigrate to Canada and slip across the border and get a good job and working for Ford or whatever. So I think, you know, the back and forth, I think had many reasons, but you know, I don't think it was because they expected agrarian paradise and ended up in Englewood, Illinois, Chicago, right?
Well, I think Don McLeod's too modest to speak up, but he was our speaker recently, and he had also pointed out that the Highlanders that came over were required to swear oaths to the crown and had to fought on the loyalist side during the American Revolutionary War, and something like 70,000 Scots exited the country after the American Revolutionary War, and many of which went to Canada, and they were offered land in Canada by the crown. So, Don, I don't mean to speak on your behalf, but
Thank you.
okay, well, I think we better wrap up for today, just to be mindful of time. But I do hope you'll all join us every month. Next month should be very interesting. Same time, same station, November 5th. And I can't thank you enough for helping us see Scottish culture flourish in America. So thank you all for joining. Be safe.
Good show. Good show.